Hello, welcome to the Research Cat. Today I wanted to present a video on the communication model, specifically as how it interacts with research. I was watching some videos on various scientific topics over the last week. This is pretty much how I'm spending my self-isolation time, is watching people's science videos and opinions that they have on science. And it occurred to me that one of the difficulties people have is they have a very sometimes unusual way of understanding how messages are transmitted and received. And I thought that perhaps it would be important to talk about the communication model specifically in the realms of research. Now, before we can get to the realms of research, I'm just going to kind of quickly run through the different communication models. Now, the characters that are framing this, this is Blaze over here, who obviously works out, and we have Julian over here. These two unfortunate boys are actually grabbed from a RPG that I'm running in Tales from the Loop. So this is pretty normal for them to be used on it. I like to give my players a little handout that when they have their characters, they tell me what they want, and then I kind of create them in DAZ program, which is what I have here. It's entertaining. So I popped them into Photoshop here, and we're looking at the same layout I had. I've had some decent feedback on this, that people are more interested in it this way, so it's a fairly easy format for me to duplicate. Now, I think what we're going to do is let's zoom in a little bit, and that will move out of so that the boys are off to the side. That way we can zoom into this board a little bit. Let's remove that for the moment, and let's look at the communication models. Now, they actually build on each other. So we're going to start with the linear model, and I'm going to take the basic communication model, and they needed more space, so they wrote up on the ledge. Okay, when we look at a communication model, we have more or less universally a sender and a receiver. Now, in some of the later models, if you look at, say, the transactional model, it's a sender-receiver that are together, and it is because of the role that you're in. But maybe I should spell receiver correctly. There we go. I think that's right. I have a note here to check because, yes, I am not always good at my I's and E's. Okay, just showing that you can have a lot of education and still not be able to spell. So the way that typically this will work is you'll have the sender that sends a message to the receiver. Now, I could, theoretically, not the one I'm looking for. I could, oh, here we go. Send here. The links to the brushes will also be in the description below. So there's this understanding, and when I was watching the videos, I saw sometimes that people would be describing the sender gives the message to the receiver, and whatever I'm sending, and I suppose that I should say that that sending is a let's change the color slightly for it. They have access to different colors of chalk, and this is what the message that I am encoding. And the receiver, in this case it would have been Julian because he was off to the side, and he is decoding that message. And that it's somehow a straightforward process. Exactly what I am saying is being decoded by the receiver as if they could read my mind. And that isn't actually the way communication works. Even in the linear model, which was developed around 1949, we understood that this was not actually the fact. So let's use yet a different color of chalk here. Not that one. And let's call this that there's noise, which you can sort of see here. Let's change that to a color that actually will show up. Okay. So there's going to be noise between the encoding and the decoding. It could be as simple as static. I'm listening to a phone call and there's static on the line and it makes it hard to understand. It could be that the context is missing a little bit, and in this model there is a context can become part of the noise. That the meaning of the word that I am saying is not the meaning of the word that the person is receiving. That could be a language barrier, or it could be something else. For instance, I went down to Tennessee and had a marvelous time looking down as a tourist several years ago. It was actually at my residency. And I went into a very nice restaurant and asked for some soda. And what I got was some sort of mineral water. I was not delighted because they said pop. And so when I just said, I don't know, just bring me whatever soda you have. And so I ended up with fizzy, bad tasting water that I don't drink. And that's because there was a context missing between what I use and what the people there at that restaurant used. So there's a couple of different things that can happen inside of this. Now, the linear model was largely not followed as well currently because it lacks feedback. But this model still does exist. Is particularly when you're going to read a book. The book is the sender. In that case, I'm receiving it. There's not a lot of feedback to give to the book. Book does not care, it's an inanimate object. The same is true for television, radio, anything where you have this top-down communication. Or I've seen in scientific papers this called a deficit mode of communication, that it's I'm giving you the message and you're going to receive it. Every now and then I run across, not so many teachers that do this, but I run across parents who believe that this is the model of communication. The teacher is over here in the sender category, the student is in the receiver category, and the teacher just imparts their wisdom onto the kids. And I run across every now and then some students that believe this should be the model in college as well. That you're going to have the professor that gives the message to it. I just want to sit back and have them tell me everything. And that really is not a very good model from learning. We've have a video before on learning. If you want to look at it, that would be great. But when we learn, we have to pass information in and out of our intelligence and memory. We're going to give feedback to that information. We manipulate the information. That's really the core of a learning process, is being able to manipulate that information. And in fact, there's a scientific paper that's down below. I would like to say that is by something like Keogh. And they were talking about parents and children and their communications in a family based on their cognitive ability. the higher the cognitive ability, there was a correlation with more understanding of communication, which means communication is potentially, the study I wouldn't say could be generalized, it was pretty small, about 80 kids were looked at, but potentially then there is a connection between cognitive abilities and communication abilities beyond just vocabulary. How likely a child is to communicate, how likely they are to understand communication signals. And so there is definitely something there. That paper is posted down below. It was from 2000, I believe. But let's develop this model just a little bit. Let's build onto it with the interactive model. Now, the interactive model basically has feedback. So I'm going to steal one of my brushes here. Well, stealing isn't, I guess, the exact word for it. This will work. So I'm just going to pop that there. And I'm going to there. Now, technically, you could have, because what this model does is after I've sent the message to the receiver is supposed to say, I understood that message, in which case I may give more feedback. One of the things that I suggest people do when they get, especially if they're not familiar with it, rather than just say, yes, I understand, instead answer, if I understand you correctly, you said, and then restate that premise in my own words. In which case they will say, no, you didn't understand me, and we're going to do it a different way. So this is a feedback loop. And what we're going to do is put in here, and let's change that color back to some version of yellow and call it feedback. So now we have the same loop that we had before, but we have now feedback, and then it also takes into account two different elements, and I'm going to use I do this a lot. I change the color of the word that I'm working with rather than the one that I want. So let's do that. And let's make that some version of green and call that a physical context. Which just got buried under my panel, so I'm just going to move the panel over. I'll move it down. We'll show his marvelous hairstyle there. And then I'm also going to have a mental context. And as I look at my notes, it's actually psychological context. So we've gotten a little bit busier here. And I think this is the model that most people, when they picture the communications model, they seem to kind of picture this. Now, remember, there's this arrow up on top as well. And I actually, as I think about that, maybe I should just do that. So let us look over at our brushes. What brush was that? Not that one. Not that one. Oh, this one. Okay. And then let's take this one and I got them in the same layer, but we can work with that. Okay. So now what we have is, and let me name that layer so that I don't forget where these things are, because they're going to have to change a little bit later. Okay. So now what we have is we have the message being sent. These are the feedbacks in both areas. I have a message that I am encoding, whatever that message is. I'm sending it down the channel because that's what this is here. And I suppose I will label that as the message. Whoops. The message, and that's the channel. And a channel is, in communications, the medium of how the message is being sent. Am I sending it by a phone message? Am I sending it by in talking in a person? Am I sending it in semaphore? I don't know. However I'm sending that message, the medium by how the message is being sent is the channel. Familiarity with that channel will also affect the message. That can be part of the medium. If you think about, for instance, that you're at a construction stop and they start waving at you, if you're not familiar with what those gestures mean at times, you can be sitting there, are they telling me to go? Are they telling me to move over? Are they telling me to slow down? I have no idea what they're telling me. But as you gain familiarity with that, that may add to your understanding of the message. The message itself at this moment is not important. Whatever I've sent the message in, and then we have a feedback onto that message. I encode the message, and the receiver decodes that message. If I encode the message and the receiver cannot decode it, they do not have the tools to decode it, it's in a different language, for instance, or it's on a channel that they don't understand, then that message has been lost. It hasn't been received. And I think sometimes people think that if I sent the message, it's up to the receiver to have that message be sent. And so I'll see people say things, for instance, that there is a, well, I made a joke and they didn't understand the joke, that's their problem. No, it's your problem for sending a message that can't be understood. Joking and sarcasm and various messages like that are not always understood. There is a classification out there of people that I call humor impaired, which is why you have to be very careful that you have some understanding of your receiver. There are some things that I might joke with my friends that I wouldn't joke with out in public. That has to do largely with perhaps education. I might be sarcastic with my friends that I'm not going to be sarcastic with when I'm giving classes, because the psychological context is not going to be the same as the people with my friends. We tend to hang out with people that are very similar to us. And so, because we tend to like people psychologically, we like people who think like us, right? There's a term for that in psychology called groupthink. It's why you have so many disastrous advertising campaigns sometimes, because I'm giving the messages to people who basically agree the same as me. In a business, in a government institution, in a university, in a classroom, you're going to have a much more diverse idea, or at least you should. If I'm in a leadership position, and I've been in that before, sometimes I bring people in to my leadership areas or into my business. I ran a business for 7 years, and I had sometimes people that I did not get along with, I did not particularly like, but I hired them because they had a different viewpoint, and they kept me from making errors that would harm the business. That's the same for government and for universities and for schools and for pretty much anything else. You want a diversity to prevent that groupthink that well, everybody believes the same as I do because I'm in my little sphere, my little bubble of everybody around me. And that's the same with friends. But I know that when I go out into a classroom, I'm not talking to people who are my friends. They don't have the context, they don't know me, and they have had different experiences. And so you have to be very careful. When I took public speaking classes, I was told, don't use sarcasm, don't use joking in any sort of public forum unless you're very explicit about it. I might tell a joke and then say, well, of course that was a joke. Or say, I'm going to be sarcastic here. You're giving cues that you wouldn't ordinarily give. If that doesn't happen, typically it means that the person that does it was not either, well, you have two choices. Either they were not a very good public speaker, that's one, or they're not considering on the model here that the receiver has to have the cues to decode that information. That is why you also will not see when you read these scientific papers and they're kind of dry, they're made to be dry. They're also made to be typically in a passive voice. That's very common because I don't want to have an exciting, active conversation here. I'm sending a message and I want that message to not have any, or at least fewer, psychological problems. That speaks towards their bias and various other things. So we really want the precision. Now, physical context is your environment. So for those of you that have had an interview and you've walked into an interview and there's one or two people and you sit there and they ask you questions, that's one. But I went to a interview and there were about 8 different people on a horseshoe and they're all asking questions at different times. And that was a more challenging interview, partly because I wear a directional hearing aid, so sometimes somebody would be talking and I have no idea where they are. I can't even face them to find out what that message is about. The way that I handle that is I speak right up in the beginning. I have a hearing aid. If I'm not ignoring you, I just didn't hear you, and wave. I've had students who they ask me, how are you? How is your day? But the physical context is I'm in a noisy classroom and I'm actually looking at somebody else, or I'm reading a sign or something. I never hear them. But I had a student about, I guess it'd be about 5 years ago, that was really angry and came into the class and was just like totally upset and said, you're teaching communications and yet I've said hello to you for the last, 2 weeks and you've just ignored me. And I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Well, it works out as I talk to the student after the class, they've been saying hello to me in the hallway and trying to have a conversation. I don't hear them. It's a crowded hallway. So their message was completely lost. Now, when we started that conversation, they felt this was my fault. Since we were looking at, in this case, a health, I was teaching medical assistants at the time. It's like, no, you as the sender have some responsibility for the message. You can't be blaming your patients because they're hard of hearing. You can't be blaming your teacher because you've been talking to their back and they don't hear you. So this is important. Now, I have a responsibility when I'm aware of this to tell people, perhaps, that I have a hearing loss, and so therefore make life easier for them. Sometimes I wish I had a little tag that I could wear that would just tell people, maybe printed on the back of my shirt, like, if you're talking to me, I don't hear you. This is not a joke. Something like that, and you know. But those kinds of problems, hard of hearing for instance, can prevent issues in the noise. There can be issues with sometimes various people who have hearing difficulties and need to read lips. Well, right now a lot of people in New York are wearing masks, and so that can be difficult because now some of those physical cues are gone. So the communication model here is a little more complicated, and we can make it more complicated yet by moving to what is probably now the more accepted model, which is the transactional model. I'm going to move these out. Probably should have just turned the layers off. Let me redo that because I might want to come back to them. Let's just turn off these models here. And then let me grab another arrow on a new layer. Here we go. And let's put the brushes back. Okay. And then let's just shrink this slightly. Sure, why not? And it didn't want to change. Of course not. But I want that to be a different color. So we're going to, oops, I deleted the layer. So we're going to put in a new color. There we go. And as you can see, I'm learning Photoshop. I actually knew Photoshop at one point really well, and then I didn't use it for like 10 years, and now I feel like I've learned it all new. Apparently, I did not keep it. And so when I first started this, I was like, oh, I'll have no problems with Premiere or anything, because at one point I taught this stuff. And then I didn't use it for probably close to 10 years, and when I went back, I was like, oh, the layout has changed, the models have changed, it's different. Let's just say it's different. We're going to add into this a couple different aspects in here, and one of the aspects that we're going to be adding in is that the sender is actually now I don't want to change that. Hello. Is actually a sender receiver. That the role in a transactional model is no longer as clearly defined. So I'm going to take this sender and I'm going to take this receiver. We know about the encoding and the decoding, so just to clean up this a little bit, we're just going to move to the sender receiver, and then over here, maybe it'd be easier to just do this, copy and paste, and then we're going to move this sender receiver over to here. So now we have the sender receiver on both cases. You still have the message and the channel. This is when this model is particularly useful when the people talking to each other in a regular conversation, it's not as clearly defined roles. If you listen to how you have conversations that are not formal conversations, you typically interrupt each other, you'll tell somebody to hold, you'll have perhaps multiple conversations involved. You're not just looking at one or two people, different people are putting thoughts in. So you have the role of both sender and receiver intermixed with each other. You still have noise, and that noise can be environmental noise, as simple as an air conditioner coming on, or it can be complicated by perhaps these contexts. You also have added in some extra contexts. So, not really what I'm looking for, thank you. And you have a cultural context. And come over here. Okay, so you have now your physical context and we have a cultural context. I'm going to hide this for the moment. Okay, and then we also have a relation. No, relational context. Got like half the word out and I was busy typing and I was like, maybe I should actually finish that word. So we have the relational context. So we've talked about psychological context and physical context, but now we have a cultural context. This would be your gender, for instance. Your age could be another one. The national part that you have. It could be any sort of it could be your socioeconomic class. So someone who talks about economics, and they will talk about this from a what's good for the country's economy, but if they happen to be wealthy, and I have this conversation frequently with someone who is not in my socioeconomic class, they're much richer than I am, and they've never been poor. That means that they are lacking some of the context that I have, but I'm also lacking their context because I don't know what that's like to not worry about your next paycheck. And that person doesn't know what it's like to not be worried. Or rather, to be worried about a paycheck. They've never had that issue. So therefore, when we talk, we have a socioeconomic cultural clash. Because I do not understand that world, and they do not really understand mine. That's not that person's fault. It does mean that there is a cultural problem, that of a socioeconomic, that when we talk, they just expect some things. And so one of the things that came up in the last conversation was, well, you don't go to work, you should be happy. And I'm like, no, I don't go to work, I don't get paid. And we're ending up talking cross purposes. There's also a relationship or relational context. That is that the role of the person, is it a boss? Is it a father? Is it a child? And so those things can color that communication. They can present challenges in the decoding or the encoding of things. I will often run into people who will tell me, well, I'm older, so you should listen to me. And I'm kind of answer usually as, well, are you smarter than me? Do you know more about this? Do you know, why would I listen to you just because you're older? I know plenty of people my age, some are even my friends, but they're not astrophysicists. They're not educators. Why would I listen to them about astrophysics or about this? Well, they have strong opinions on the thought. You know, whatever it is that we're talking about. Why do I care? So these sorts of things come up, and there's these assumptions, and we've talked about assumptions in multiple videos before, that assumptions, if I'm older and I believe that everybody should listen to me because I am older, that is an assumption that is hardwired right into my message. And so when the person is pushing back against that and saying, well, just because you're older doesn't mean anything, that can become an issue, right? There's noise inside of this that's relational, but it's also going to be psychological. Now, when we look at these kinds of communication models, and we have to consider this from a research viewpoint, because that's what this channel is really about. When I look at this, I have to keep in mind these different contexts in order to be able to research effectively. As an example, I was teaching a course on, I actually think that the course was on Premiere, but we're going to say it's communication. And when I talk about Premiere, I mean Adobe Premiere. But they had an assignment that they're going to present some sort of a report in a short movie form. But I wanted them to go out and do some research. It was in a college setting, so I wanted them to go talk to, they could pick any topic they wanted. I didn't care what the topic was, provided it wasn't illegal. But I wanted them to find somebody who knew something about that topic, who was an authority on that topic for whatever reason. And I remember I had a student who wanted to do something on downloading music. And at the time, the downloading music was in the news all the time. And so, and his position was that it was fine and there were no problems. And so he went and talked to a band as his authority. When he turned in the transcript of that interview, the band absolutely had a problem with it, because if you can imagine this, they wanted to be paid. And of course, I'm being sarcastic there. That yes, they do want to be paid. They don't want people downloading their music for free with no reasons. But this person did not like that. And so basically took parts of that message that they had and then left out other parts that were not convenient. They kind of pruned the message down. And he was like shocked that he got like a D in that part. And I said, well, the problem is you didn't plagiarize, right? That isn't plagiarism. But it also isn't ethical. It's like you should be happy you didn't fail, because you took the message and you changed their words by taking their words and manipulating them to mean a different context so that you could still present your own bias. And you cannot be doing that as a researcher. You have to be as close to possible to give the message in a correct way. And they were very unhappy. We ended up going all the way up to the dean, but we already have this. It's already set up. So when we went finally to the hearing, the result was that he got his grade lowered and failed the course and had to repeat. Because it's not an ethical way to conduct research. It's not an ethical way to take information. And I see this done all the time by politicians, and it's why I have a bias when people say that they're going into government for a leadership position. Because I should not be taking information, leaving information out, and then presenting it. And saying, well, that's the way this works. Somebody said this. Well, yes, but what did they say in the sentence before or the sentence after? What was the context of this? And when we're talking about context, we're actually talking about another word, which is nuance. And so when we're looking at a nuanced discussion, this is sometimes what is missing. That when we have that discussion, we're not being precise. We're generalizing information. Now, I've talked about generalizing scientific studies, that if 80 children have this, this cognitive communication correlation, that can't be generalized to mean every child in the United States or the world, even if it makes sense. I first have to address this as well, this is a foundation for why we need to do more research for this. When I'm recording this, it's on April 30th, and there was just a big thing out in the news about a pair of doctors that were saying that the coronavirus wasn't as serious as they thought it was, and apparently they posted this on Facebook. Now, I don't know, I personally do not get my news from Facebook, but the American Association of Doctors said that this was actually not correct. They took a small sample size, 5,000 more or less, but the problem was it was a small sample size of only people who walked into a urgent care, I believe. And there is an issue there, because that's not a general population. And so, therefore, to generalize that is an issue. There's and I'll probably address this in a later video, but there's a study by Anderson that was done in the 70s on video game violence. And that was done in a psychiatric facility. The Anderson, who was the doctor that did it, warned that it could not be generalized, but it was generalized, that people in that psychiatric facility who already had violent tendencies would then play violent video games and then show more violent tendencies. And that research was used for years, up to, I believe this year, I just saw an article about it, as video games create violence, which is not what the purpose of the original research was, and it's a very select group. In actual fact, when we break that out into a larger population, those findings don't hold. But that wasn't the thrust of Anderson's research in the first place. It was that certain people under certain influences can act a certain way. In that case, the lens was video game violence. So we really have to, as researchers, take into account the model of communication for context, that there is a relational context. As a professor in a classroom, I expect students to act a certain way that I do not expect them when I'm, say, at a gaming table running, in this case, from these two characters, Tales from the Loop, or Dungeons & Dragons, or World of Darkness, for example. There's a physical context of what is the environment that we're in. Currently, I'm working at a computer help desk, and the person was totally upset because they want to be on ground. This is much harder for them to do computers. Well, I got you. I mean, I have no that's not something that I can do, that I can help you with. I'll do the best that I can, but we're going to be over the computers, over the web, being able to do this. As a strange aside on that, I did ask what that person's program was, and she said that she was in computer coding, and so I was a little confused. I didn't ask any further, but if you're taking a major on computer coding and you hate computers, that doesn't really sound like a winning combination to me. You have to take into account psychological context of what are your readers? Who is giving you this research? Is this research you're conducting on your own? And is that to prove that a particular point? Because research in general, specifically academic research, is not designed for proof. You're not creating something to prove something else. And in fact, when you go to do your master's thesis or your doctoral dissertation, or perhaps, depending on the college, your final senior year thesis in your bachelor's degree, you will be told that when you're giving your opinion on this based on your research, it is not proof. That is not the role of research. You would need, in order to create proof on something, you would have to start getting into meta-analysis, which I haven't covered yet in videos, and I eventually will. I have no end of topics. And you have to consider cultural context. There are cultural differences both in countries, in societies, within states, within regions, within genders, within sexual orientations. And so we have to consider all of this when we start putting together some sort of a research. And I would ask that people that do research to please be nuanced and precise about what exactly you are talking about. And when you're using the rules of evidence, that it's actually evidence, not anecdotes, for example. Because that will make your message more clear. The goal is to have a clear message that can be understood by the people in your field when you're conducting academic research. If you thought that this was a useful video or you liked it, then you can give me a like. Oops, I didn't mean to zoom in. Let me zoom out again. And if you're always welcome to subscribe. I'm putting out 2 videos a time right now. I believe the next video is going to hinge upon the communication model in a book review, Silent Voices, which is a academic textbook put out by Albany University, but there's actually another communication book which is by Susan Elgin, which is a series of communication books. So we'll see which one it goes, but probably Silent Voices because it's more academic. And the other video is the Let's Play of right now Oxygen Not Included as a educational game for problem solving, which I'm actually failing at this moment. So we'll see how that goes as well. And then I have some hopes as the channel grows and more people subscribe and watch it to start a 3rd set of videos on Saturday. So we'll see how that comes, but that is in the works, and I've actually started creating the scripts. So if you're interested in more videos on a particular content, that is actually going to be looking at gaming in a book or a paper form as social situations. But the main part of the channel is these the content videos here, which is on some aspect of research, because while I really like games and I think games are an excellent way to teach, I'm also very interested and sometimes slightly fanatical even about people doing their research and doing the research well. It's fine to make errors. Errors happen all the time. God knows I make enough of them. However, we do have to try to limit those errors, and part of that is knowing how to research correctly. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.